In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, God is one. Amen. Well, good morning. I can see you've got Christos and Alex. Good morning to you both. God bless you. The weather has certainly taken a turn for the more autumnal here in Lincoln. Grey, miserable. It's not raining or anything like that, but certainly it's very dull. So there it's going to be a busy day today, one way and another. I've done quite a lot already today, so we're running short on holy water, so I've blessed the waters and prepared bottles and stuff and filled holy water. And then I'll be rushing off to go and visit graves and things later on. This afternoon I've got quite a lot happening, and then this evening we've got the monthly Equip course that takes place here as well. Equip is a theological course that the Antiochians in this country run, and we'll be having a group of that in the church here today. More people have turned up. Good morning, Dino. Christos loves autumn. I wish I did. I really don't like it at all. In some ways, I prefer winter. At least with winter, you know what's coming, whereas autumn is everything. Mist and mellow fruitfulness, fine, but it just feels like damp and grey and death to me. Rain, grey, dark in Yorkshire. Good morning, Vicky. Good morning, Melengath. The heating is on. Been avoiding it. Lots of gardening to do. Yep, I've not put on the heating yet, either in the church, although today it definitely feels as if it needs it, or in the house, where I'm going to try and hang on until the end of October because it's so expensive. Good morning, Anthony, and good morning, Tony. Damp, cold, grey Ireland. Oh dear, that's fulfilling all our expectations. Okay, today we're going to be looking at some really interesting horticulture from St. Paul. We'll have a little look at it tomorrow as well, God willing, but particularly today. The horticulture is not the sort of way that you wish to behave in your own garden, but it's certainly the way that you need to behave in Christian charity to all those people around you. Beverly, good morning. Time for vests. Well, you see, Beverly, it's like this with me. I'm always cold, or almost always cold. And just to give you an idea, I have a TOG 18 duvet on my bed. And even, well, throughout the entire summer this year and last year, in fact, for as long as I can remember, I've always had my all-night under blanket on as well. Otherwise, I just get very cold. And then I'm snuggled up in goodness only knows what to go to bed in. And the same really during the day. I always have about 14 different layers on, even when it's roasting hot outside. Some of those in the monastery were astonished to discover how much I was wearing, even in the hottest weather. There we go. Cold-blooded, that's what it must be. Cruel, heartless, and cold-blooded. Anyway, here we go. Verses 16 through to 24. That's not the natural end of that bit, but otherwise we need to go to verse 36 and be here for at least an hour. For, says St. Paul, if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches were broken off, and you, he's talking to the Gentiles, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and the fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. Well said. Because of unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. And if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. Therefore consider the goodness and severity of God on those who fell severely, but towards you goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise you also will be cut off, and they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you are cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, who are natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Melengeth, who's working in horticulture at the moment, take no notice of St. Paul's horticultural methods. There are a number of things you could say about this. It's got a lot to say for people like me, and also for the church as a whole, and for those people who become Christian later on and who raise up their noses in disdain at those people who were Christian all along from shortly after their birth. Okay, so just bear that in mind. And it's simple, really, in a nutshell, or as one of my teachers when I was a schoolboy used to say, in the shell of a nut. He was a nice man. Easily my favourite teacher, and he taught biology, and I loved that subject, and I therefore loved him as well. And I loved him and therefore loved the subject. It went both ways. Anyway, in the shell of a nut, St. Paul is telling those Gentile Christians to be humble, not to be stuck up, not to be like a rooster or a cockerel crowing over those that are there before them. So verse 16, if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. That doesn't make a huge amount of sense, does it, in English? But you have to go back all the way back to the book of Numbers. Numbers chapter 15, verses 18 to 21, to make some sort of sense of the first part of that. What happened was this: when you made bread, you took out 1/10 of it, and you offered that to the church, to the temple. Eventually, of course, it actually went to the priests, and they then cooked it, and they then ate it. And this 10th part made the whole of it holy. I'll read it to you. Again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, when you come into the land into which I bring you, then it will be, when you eat from the bread of the land, that you shall take away the choice portion for the Lord. You shall separate the choice portion of your bread as first fruits of the dough, as a choice portion from the threshing floor. Thus shall you separate it, as the first fruits of your dough, and you shall give to the Lord the choice portion throughout your generations." Okay? And by giving 1/10 of the harvest, basically, to the temple and to the priests, you then sanctified the whole of the rest of it. Now, those of us who are orthodox already will be well used to this, because you know how it is when you grow tomatoes in your garden. The 10th of your produce people used to bring to the church and offer to the priest, and the priest would then bless it. It then became his property. And people, roughly 10 families per priest, and the 10 families would each of them give to the priest 1/10 of the produce from their farms. And this meant the priest then had exactly 1/10 of the produce of his village. And on that, his family lived. Of course, 1/10 of that went from him to the bishop. And the bishop then lived on 1/10 of the produce of his diocese. And 1/10 of that he would then pass on, and so on and so on and so on. So it was a way of making sure that everybody had plenty. And everybody had 90% of whatever it was that they had gained to begin with. It's quite a good way of sorting things out. And certainly if one did do that, we could afford to have very many more clergy in this country and throughout the world. and clergy would not be put on a great pinnacle, because every 10th man in the church would indeed be a priest, and live amongst those people with a tenth of the amount of money they had, and would also be able to work and so on, and do all the things they needed to do. But the point was there that St. Paul is saying, if the first fruit, so that 10th bit, is holy, then the lump of dough is also holy. Now, something like this happens whenever I make prospera, because usually when I make prospera, I'll also make bread for myself. And I usually make 3 loaves in one go. So you're dealing with quite a large amount of dough. So I make about 1.5 pounds of flour per prospera. A prospera, for those people who don't know, are the liturgical breads that are brought to the church to be consecrated and become the body of Christ. So I will take the flour and make dough, and then divide it into 3 lots, and 2 lots I make into prospera, and then the next lot I make more dough and add into it, so it's sort of more or less half white flour and half brown flour, and then make my own loaves out of that for my own use. You see, that's a rather nice thing there, because you're cooking in the oven and the whole thing will be made in one go, and some of this bread will come to the church and be consecrated, and some of this bread from the original loaf will be eaten by me and those people who are having hospitality with me. That's what I do here in Lincoln anyway, and we can do the same sort of thing elsewhere. I always feel slightly sorry for that flour that just missed being consecrated. The same happens again when I take out the lamb, which is the central section of the loaf, and consecrate that as well. I always feel slightly sorry for those molecules just to the right, just to the left, just above, just below the bit that I have just consecrated. I always feel slightly sort of fellow feeling with those bits of flour, just missed out somehow, nearly, but not quite. I'd rather be right on the very edge of the loaf and have, but there we are. That's the way things are. That's how I always feel about these things. But you sort of make the entire thing holy, and certainly for me, when I'm eating the loaves over the rest of the week, that loaf over the rest of the week, I have this feeling of somehow rather still being partaking, as it were, of the liturgy, because the whole thing came from the same batch. Okay? And then quite suddenly, St. Paul, having said this, and Tertius having written it down, has a new idea in his head. He's talked about dough so far, and now he mixes his metaphor, rather changes it, and he says, if the root is holy, so is the branches. And now he's begun to think about an olive tree. He's thinking about this olive tree that has been growing away for generations. It's one of the interesting things, and people who are watching this who are Greek or come from Mediterranean countries, or maybe in Australia, hoping now that John has long now stopped being put on lockdown. There we are, maybe not. I think Melbourne might be the only place that's still in lockdown in Australia. But if you live somewhere like that, you'll be used to the idea of olive trees that are a couple of 1,000 years old and have been tended for as long as anybody can remember, and well beyond that. And that's what St. Paul has got in his mind: huge, old, venerable olive trees. Now, if you don't know this, if you go to the Middle East, or even to somewhere like Spain, you'll see rows upon huge olive trees, and you'll see that there are new branches growing off them all the time. And some of the old branches are routinely sawn off, and then the olive will then sprout new branches from that and produce something new. You'll also sometimes in the woods and other places find self-setting olives that have set seed from somewhere or other and begun to grow. These are obviously wild ones. They're not the specially grown, grafted in, beautiful olive trees that are going to produce some sort of succulent, delicious olive. And they often produce quite tiny olives that are even more difficult to process than the ordinary olives are. Okay, so you've got those ideas in your mind. And St. Paul is starting off by saying, okay, if the root is holy of the olive tree, then the whole of the rest of the tree is going to be holy as well. And you have to have this in your mind when you think now about what he's going to do or says has happened to this olive tree. Okay? Because verse 17, something quite drastic happens. The farmer, that's God, comes along. And if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and the fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. So here we have the farmer goes up to the olive tree, and he looks to see that now these old branches here that he has been tending most carefully for a very long time are no longer producing the fruit that he's looking for. So what does he do? He cuts them off. He tears them off. Okay, rips these things off, and off come these bits. And he might well actually look round. This is rather strange. He might well look round and find some wild new shoots that look to be producing the sort of olives that he's after, and cut those and graft those back. Should we say graft those back onto the original tree. Okay, these will now grow really well, really fast and really well. And of course, he's talking to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles have been doing jolly well, having been grafted into Israel, onto the original olive tree. And some of them are looking around rather snootily, poo-pooing the branches that had been broken off. But what did St. Paul say earlier? He said, they are holy. If the root is holy, the branches are holy too. And we need to think about this even now when we're thinking about Judaism, and Israel, and so on. If the root is holy, the branches are holy also. They might not be producing the fruit that we'd expect from people who should be expecting the Messiah, but they are holy. And St. Paul has the idea that these are all ripped off the olive tree and they're sitting around the base of the olive tree. They haven't been thrown away and they have not been burned. Okay? I say it's rather strange horticulture, but that's what we have to have in our heads. All right? So far, so good. Now, if like me, you have quite a number of people who are converts coming into the Orthodox Church, and I allow somebody to remain a convert for about a year. After that, they cannot call themselves a convert, they belong. They need to work hard, therefore, about making themselves part of the church. But sometimes you get people who come into the church and they look around and they find fault with all of those people, including historical people, who have brought the church to where it is now. And they look down on people who they call cradle Orthodox, because of their fervour is not like the converts. God help us and save us from convert fervour. It can be very damaging indeed. But somebody rather who's being gently eased into the Orthodox Church, gently eased into Christianity, someone or other who's being helped to be inspired by what has gone before, has been truly grafted onto the original root or maybe the branch, the Orthodox Church. And that branch is attached to, in the end, the root, which comes all the way from the patriarchs. Okay? So here we've got two interesting metaphors that St. Paul is offering us. And the fathers have arguments about bits of it. They say, for instance, well, the lump. Who is the lump? Is the lump Christ? Or is the lump the faithful remnant of Israel? Overall, most of them tend to say that the lump, okay, the piece that has been, the bits, the first fruit that's been offered to God out of the dough, that is the faithful remnant, and then that then blesses and makes holy the rest of Israel. And then with the tree analogy, the root are the patriarchs, the prophets, the Old Testament sacrifices, the temple worship, and the Judaism, the tradition of the Jews, and of course Christ himself. All of those things. And what we need to be is thoroughly grafted onto that. That's why it is that the Old Testament, reading the scriptures, understanding Judaism, is so important. We need to understand ourselves in relation to what has gone before. There have been heretics in the past who have poo-pooed the Old Testament and not wanted to read it, or looked at it and thought this is from another God or about another completely different religion and so on. But actually what we call the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, and a lot of the Jewish practices and things, we need to understand. Many of them, of course, have been brought wholesale into the church. And that is very helpful, including things like offering a tenth of your produce. Nowadays, people might offer a tenth of their income. And that is the sort of thing to keep in mind. Okay? And then, verse 17. Well, we said that already. Do not boast. So, Paul has turned to the Gentiles. Okay, he said the branches of the carefully cultivated tree have been taken off, and now wild, uncultivated branches have been grafted in. The old tree, fruitful for years, cultivated, prepared, pruned, looked after, bugs shaken off it and all the rest of it. The new wild one from actually back then an idolatrous background. The lopped off branches are, of course, the unbelieving part of Israel, the unbelieving Jews. 18, but don't be stuck up, do not boast against the branches. But if you do, don't forget that the root supports you, not the other way around. And those roots, as I said before, the patriarchs, prophets, all the Old Testament riches that we enjoy within our worship and everything else, all of that comes from the Hebrews, the Israelites, the Jews, Christ himself. And Israel of old is still, and you might say even now, the bearer of salvation in that it produced Christ. Not just Christ, but all the apostles. Not just the apostles, but the Theotokos. Not just them, but the 70 apostles as well, produced all of them. The apostles of the 70. And not just them, but produced the whole of the scriptures. Not one word of scripture was not written by somebody who didn't come from Judaism or from Israel. Okay, so we have to be really thankful for that. Then 19 through to 22. You will say then, branches are broken off that I might be granted in. Well said. Because of unbelief they're broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either. Therefore consider the goodness and severity of God. On those who fell, severity, but towards you, goodness. If you continue in his goodness. I think that's fairly obvious. God broke off the branches he tended. He had no further use for them. As it happens, and it wasn't consequent on the branches being broken off, but as it happened, the Gentiles were then grafted in. but they too will be snapped off if they don't produce any fruit. Somebody or other who becomes a member of the church, if they do not produce the fruit that is required by the church, then you too get snapped off. God has no use for you either. If I don't produce the fruit that is worthy of a priest in the church, I too will be snapped off. God will have no use for me. Important for us to remember. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, that's a long-winded way around it. What St. Paul is saying sounds pretty well the opposite. I'll say it again. If they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. He's saying, on the other hand, the branches have been broken off, which have not been thrown away. If they turn back to God, if they start to believe, then God can regraft them back onto the tree. And then he carries on, for if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature onto a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, who are natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? So you get this idea from Paul that there is still plenty of hope for Israel. They have rejected the Messiah at that time, and therefore, as he says, they have been snapped off the tree, but they haven't withered away and died. There is still time. They have not been thrown away. If they start to believe, there is still time for them to be grafted back onto the original rootstock, the original olive tree. And when they do that, if and when they do that, then there'll be no stopping them. Whereas Gentiles are in some way unnaturally grafted onto the olive tree, the Gentiles, as the Jews rather, when they're grafted back into Christianity, they will flourish and grow and overtake in some ways what will be there before. Those branches, as it were, will take to Christianity in the same way as ducks take to water. Okay? And there we go. So something for us all to think about, not to allow ourselves to be pig-headed about. Right, now, what's quite happened here? Rather bizarre. Right, I've lost all the people I was going to be praying for. There is somebody called Victoria that I'd like you to pray for, please. She died the other day. If you pray for her and for her family, they're also very bereaved. And we're continuing to pray for Judy, who is learning how to talk into a microphone, and this then dictates. You dictate into the microphone, and this then writes what she wants to say. It's quite amusing. I find if I'm writing letters like that, and you say something like full stop, or period, or space, or semicolon, the way it often writes down, full stop, semicolon, space, and so on, until it gets used to you, and then it begins to do things properly. Right, let's see if people are saying anything. No, they're not. That's good. Vera also feels sorry for the crumbs which have been thrown away. Yes. To be the flour that is only used for dusting the tray. Dino, in my youth, lived on a kibbutz near Tiberias and worked on an olive field. How wonderful! Snapping the heads of new roots could grow. Tough but satisfying work back then. It was hot and tiring work. But what an amazing, wonderful experience. Good for you. Too few people take hold of the possibility of experiences like that. What an astonishing thing to have been able to do. That's just fantastic. I feel genuinely envious of that experience. Okay, right, well, Pray for each other, pray for the monastery, for our future there and so on. There's lots of planning going on at the moment. And we need to think about all sorts of things there. Project 67, now sadly no more. I wonder whether we can look at Project 67 and see what all that was about. Very good. Okay, 31 minutes. Maybe one day I'll actually do 10 minutes. Who knows? I'll practice and try and do so. Okay, your prayers, God willing, here tomorrow and also the next. In fact, the rest of this week, I've had to replan things, so things are going to happen a bit differently. Okay, righto. God bless you. Good morning, Natalia. And also Jovan, I think I saw you a moment ago. Let me just have a look back. Is Jovan there? I think he was. Yes, there you are, Jovan. God bless you. And thank you, Christos. God bless you all.